this morning. We're enormously excited for today's presentations and discussions. As I mentioned last night, we would absolutely love for this to be a conversation. So I'm hoping everyone chimes in with your thoughts, your questions, all of the things that occur to you. We had a fantastic night last night. I hope everyone had a great time having drinks and seeing Carlos Slim and Beth Comstock and Tony Fidel speak, and had a great chance to actually visit with each other at dinner and didn't get burned by the smoke coming out of the there was a moment when Carlos Slim got up and you sort of, as you listened, you heard the light fuzz of dry ice across the room. Before we jump in, I just wanted to remind everyone, if you haven't got a chance to feel free to download the app and use it to communicate with each other and with us. Also, on the back of your badge are all the Twitter handles, as well as the instructions on how to sign up for the internet. If you're, I don't imagine anyone in this room has any smartphones or devices, or maybe wants to be online while we're having the conversation. But if you do, on the back of your badge is all the information. And before we jump in, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, sort of as a frame for today's conversations. About 3 or 4 years ago, when I was doing research for this book on the science of productivity, I came across this really interesting research that was happening at Stanford by these two researchers named James Barron and Michael Hannon. In the early 1990s, Barron and Hannon decided that they wanted to try and figure out which culture was the best culture for companies. Now, it's the early 1990s, they're working at Stanford. They don't particularly have much interest in tech, but because there's all these new companies that are starting around Stanford in the early 1990s, before many people even had email, they decide, okay, we're going to focus on tech companies, tech startups, as a laboratory for looking at how cultures emerge. And they go and they take about 15 years to do this. They talk to 200 companies, do thousands of interviews. They talk to some of the companies that end up being the largest, most important companies on Earth. And as they're doing this, and they're asking questions of executives about how they fire and hire, how they decide on compensation plans, how they decide to create a culture, they notice that consistently there's these 5 models that keep on coming up again and again and again. Now, the first one was this model that they refer to as the star culture. In the star culture, most of you are familiar with companies like this. Can we bring that up? The star culture is essentially predicated on this idea that the way to build a company is to hire the best and the brightest and put them together, right? Venture capitalists, particularly in the Valley, love this model. You go out and you find people who've graduated from the best schools, you find people who work at your best competitors, you put them in a room, you sit back and you let them do amazing things. Everyone kind of figures this is a no-brainer. This is if you can get access to these folks, this is the best way to build a company. The second model that they find is a little bit different from the star culture, and they refer to it as engineering culture. And in engineering culture, what they found is that there weren't necessarily any stars yet, but that as a rule, an engineering ethos seemed to kind of pervade everything that happened. You go out and you use engineering logic to decide all your cultural issues about who you hire and what kind of questions you ask when you're hiring, how to create policies. And the great thing about an engineering culture is that because everyone comes from a similar mindset, the culture is very easy to establish very quickly. It can scale very, very fast. When we think about Facebook in its early days, it's an engineering culture. They're able to grow because everyone comes from a common decision-making background. The next 2 cultures that they found are kind of like 2 sides of a coin. One they refer to as the bureaucratic culture. In a bureaucratic culture, process is king, right? The founders from the start sit down and they figure out how things are going to work, and they write big books, handbooks, that they can hand to new employees. There's regular stand-ups. There's weekly all-hands meetings. It's very easy to onboard people into a bureaucratic culture because you can tell them exactly how things work. Everyone knows the process. In autocratic culture, and about 5 or 7% of the companies that they profiled were autocratic, is just like a bureaucratic culture, except that it's all based on the whims of one individual, which is usually the founder or the CEO. They tell you how things work, and that's how things work. And one autocratic CEO told the researchers that he has a basic thing that he tells everyone when he hires them, which is, you do what I say and I'll make you rich. And that pretty much works in getting culture across. That was like a knowing laugh. I think we've all been exposed to that kind of a company. And then the last model that they found is this thing called commitment culture. Now, commitment culture is like a throwback to the 1950s, right? Commitment CEOs say things like, I want to build a company where people only leave when they retire or die. In a commitment culture, very often in the early stages of a company, they'll use precious dollars to hire HR representatives instead of engineers or other executives. So Barron and Hannon, and I'll mention one other thing about commitment culture. Many of the firms that they talked to, the CEOs hated the commitment culture. They said that they thought that this is what had brought down American manufacturing. This is GM. So Barron and Hannon, they collect all this data. They follow these companies for 15 years. They see some grad school dropouts become some of the richest, most powerful business people in the world. They see other high-flying executives crash and burn. And when they're done with the project, they look at these cultures and they start tracking who was most successful. Now, unsurprisingly, the star culture had some of the biggest successes. It turns out that if you take a bunch of smart people and you put them in a room together, you get amazing things sometimes. And venture capitalists, because they're investing in a portfolio of companies, they love star cultures because you have these breakout hits. But interestingly, some of the biggest failures were also the star cultures. Because as all of us know, the problem is when you take a bunch of stars and you put them in a room together, sometimes there's a competition because everyone wants to be the star. You get decisions that are sometimes made on personal whims instead of logical analysis. You get much more internal politics and rivalries. So they looked at the other models and they tried to figure out which one was best. And heads and shoulders, unequivocally, they found that commitment culture is the #1 performer for companies. Regardless of what part of the industry they were in, regardless of whether they started small and got big or they were a huge venture-backed, huge success from the start, commitment culture, not one commitment culture firm went bankrupt during the entire project. Commitment culture companies were the fastest to IPO. They had the highest profitability ratios. And what was most interesting is that they found that every other type of culture, after 4 years, if that company was still in business, it started moving towards being a commitment culture. Because they found, and all of you know this, that the biggest cost that a company can have is losing good employees. Not only do you lose all this training you've done with the person, but they tend to bring all of their best ideas and their clients to competitors. A commitment culture ended up performing better than any other kind of firm. And the reason I mention this, and the reason why I think this research is interesting, is because one of the things that I'm hoping we all talk about today, the kind of the purpose of bringing all these folks onto stage and dialoguing with all of you, is commitment cultures are important, but that doesn't mean that they're easy, right? Simply saying that we have a commitment culture doesn't mean that we just say, I'm committed to you and I want you to either retire or die before you leave. I was talking to one of our colleagues in the audience last night, and he was saying that as his company has grown from a startup to a more mature company, that he faces this basic problem, which is he had startup employees who were fantastic, and now that they're a more mature company, they need different kinds of employees. And some of the advice he's gotten is, fire the startup employees. You're not doing a service to your own company or to them by putting them in an environment where they can't succeed. That doesn't mean that you're not a commitment culture. To help people find better opportunities for themselves when your company has changed. But we do know that in order to retain the best people, to attract the best people, we have to make hard decisions. That there's sophisticated trade-offs about how we hire, how we fire, how we promote. And so part of our goal today is to have a conversation with all of you about the best tactics and insights and leadership lessons about building companies where people can be their best selves, but at the same time, face those hard questions that entails. And with that, I'm enormously pleased to invite on stage someone who has taken a company that was great and now is even better and had a rocky patch in the middle that most of us didn't even probably realize was going on, and has taken creative individuals and has brought them to a new height. Please join me in welcoming onto the stage Richard Plepler, the CEO of Home Box Office.